George Washington Parke Custis was the step-grandson and adopted son of United States President George Washington, the grandson of Martha Washington and the father-in-law of Robert E. Lee. He spent part of his large inherited fortune constructing Arlington House on a plantation that was directly across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. After Custis died, his daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, who had married Robert E. Lee, inherited his estate. The United States government confiscated the Custis estate during the American Civil War. After the war ended, the Supreme Court of the United States rescinded the confiscation and returned the estate to George Washington Custis Lee, the son of Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee and Robert E. Lee. George Washington Custis Lee then sold the estate back to the United States government. Arlington House is now the Robert E. Lee Memorial. The remainder of the Arlington plantation is now Arlington National Cemetery in Fort Myer. Custis purchased, preserved and displayed many of George Washington's belongings, wrote historical plays about Virginia, delivered a number of patriotic addresses, and wrote a memoir of his life in the Washington household. Early life. George Washington Parke Custis was born on April 30, 1781, at his mother's family home at Mount Airy, a restored mansion now in Rosaryville State Park in Prince George's County, Maryland. He initially lived with his parents John Parke Custis and Eleanor Calvert Custis, and his sisters Elizabeth Parke Custis, Martha Parke Custis and Nellie Custis, at Abingdon Plantation, which his father had purchased in 1778. However, 6 months after G.W.P. Custis was born, his father died of camp fever at Yorktown, shortly after the British Army surrendered there. Custis' grandmother, Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, had earlier married George Washington and had raised at Mount Vernon G.W.P. Custis' father, John Parke Custis. After John Parke Custis died, George Washington adopted his namesake G.W.P. Custis, and with Martha Washington raised Custis and his sister, Nellie Custis, at Mount Vernon. G.W.P. Custis' two oldest sisters, Elizabeth and Martha, remained at Abingdon with their widowed mother, who in 1783 married Drive David Stewart, an Alexandria physician and associate of George Washington. The Washingtons brought George and Nellie, 8 and 10 years old, respectively, to New York City in 1789 to live in the first and second presidential mansions. Following the transfer of the national capital to Philadelphia, the original First family occupied the president's house from 1790 to 1797. G.W.P. Custis attended from the Germantown Academy in Germantown, Pennsylvania, the College of New Jersey and St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. George Washington repeatedly expressed frustration about young Custis, as well as his own inability to improve the youth's attitude. Upon young Custis' return to Mount Vernon after only one term at St. John's, George Washington sent him to his mother and stepfather at Hope Park, writing, "He appears to me to be moped and stupid, says nothing, and is always in some hole or corner excluded from the company." Career. In January 1799, Custis was commissioned as a cornet in the United States Army and was promoted to second lieutenant in March. He served as aide-de-camp to General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and was honorably discharged 15 June 1800. When G.W.P. Custis came of age, he inherited large amounts of money, land and property from the estates of his father and grandfather. Upon Martha Washington's death in 1802, he received a bequest from her as well as his father's former plantations because of the termination of her life estate. However, her executor Bushrod Washington refused to sell to G.W.P. Custis the Mount Vernon estate where he had been living, so he moved into the 4-room, 80-year-old house on land inherited from his father, who had called it Mount Washington. Almost immediately, G.W.P. Custis began constructing Arlington House. Hiring George Hadfield as architect, he built the first non-government Georgian-style building. As the highlight of the largest plantation in the new capital city, he built on a prominent hill overlooking both the Georgetown-Alexandria Turnpike, as well as the capital across the Potomac River, using slave labor and materials on site, and interrupted by the War of 1812. G.W.P. Custis finally completed the mansion's exterior in 1818. Custis intended the mansion to serve as a living memorial to George Washington, and included design elements similar to Mount Vernon. He then gained a reputation for inviting many guests for various celebrations and social events at the mansion, where he also displayed relics from Mount Vernon, although the interior was not completed until occupancy by Robert E. Lee's family in the 1850s. During the War of 1812, he volunteered in the defense of Washington, D.C., at the Battle of Bladensburg. He also delivered and published an address condemning the death of Revolutionary War General James Lingan, who was killed by a Baltimore mob for defending an anti-war publisher's right to oppose the war. Custis was elected a member of the American Antiquarian Society in 1815. One biographer claimed Lafayette and his son George Washington de Lafayette visited Custis at Mount Vernon in 1825, although Custis was then living at Arlington House. During the 1820s, Custis was an active member of the American Colonization Society, an organization that supported the colonization of free blacks in Africa, particularly in Liberia. Colonization was unpopular with African American slaves. Of the Arlington slaves, only William Burke and his family chose to move to Liberia. Custis lost interest in the society, but his wife and daughter continued to support it for many years. In 1854, William and Rosabella Burke and their children left Arlington House for Monrovia, Liberia, with their children. Rosabella continued to write to Mrs. Lee and named a new daughter, Martha, in tribute to the family. On July 4, 1848, Custis attended the ceremony that celebrated the laying of the cornerstone of the Washington Monument by Freemasons, supervised by President James K. Polk. The ceremony also attracted 20,000 other spectators. On July 4, 1850, Custis dedicated a stone from the people of the District of Columbia to the monument at a ceremony that President Zachary Taylor attended 5 days before he died. In 1853, the writer Benson John Lossing visited Custis at Arlington House. Custis achieved some distinction as an orator and playwright. In addition to the Lingan eulogy, he delivered the celebration of the Russian victories in Georgetown, District of Columbia, on 5 June, 1813. Two of Custis's plays, The Indian Prophecy, or Visions of Glory, and Pocahontas, or The Settlers of Virginia, were published during his lifetime. Other plays included The Railroad, The 8th of January, or Hurrah for the Boys of the West, North Point, or Baltimore Defended, and Montgomery, or The Orphan of a Wreck. Custis wrote a series of biographical essays about his adoptive father that were compiled and published in 1859 and 1850 as Recollections and Private Memoirs of Washington after his death in 1857. Family ties. Custis descended from a number of aristocratic colonial-era families, as well as, through his mother, the British nobility and, very distantly, from the royal House of Hanover and the House of Stuart. George Washington Parke Custis's mother, Eleanor Calvert Custis Stuart, descended from Charles Calvert, 3rd Baron Baltimore, and Henry Lee of Ditchley, one of whose descendants was Edward Lee, 1st Earl of Litchfield, who married Lady Charlotte Fitzroy, an illegitimate daughter of Charles II by one of his mistresses, Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland. It is believed he is descended from George I by his natural daughter Melusina von der Schulenburg, Countess of Walsingham. whose extramarital liaison with the 5th Baron Baltimore produced a son, Benedict Swingert Calvert, his maternal grandfather. His father, John Parke Custis, was the son of Martha Washington through her marriage to Daniel Parke Custis. Custis' sister, Eleanor Parke Custis Lewis, married George Washington's nephew, Lawrence Lewis. As a wedding present, Washington gave Nellie a section of Mount Vernon's land, on which the Lewises established the Woodlawn Plantation and constructed the Woodlawn Mansion. The National Park Service has listed Woodlawn on the National Register of Historic Places. Another sister of G.W.P. Custis, Martha Parke Custis Peter, married Thomas Peter. Using Martha's inheritances from George and Martha Washington, the Peters purchased property in Georgetown, within the District of Columbia. The couple then constructed the Tudor Place mansion on the property. Tudor Place and its grounds, which the National Park Service has listed on the National Register of Historic Places, contain features that resemble those of Arlington House and Woodlawn. On July 7, 1804, Custis married Mary Lee Fitzhugh. Of their 4 children, only one daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, survived to maturity. She married Robert E. Lee at Arlington House on June 30, 1831. Lee's father, Henry Lee III, had earlier eulogized George Washington at Washington's December 18, 1799, funeral. In 1826, Custis admitted paternity of Maria Carter, who had been born in 1803 to Ariana Carter, an African-American slave maid at the Arlington estate who had earlier resided at Mount Vernon as a slave of Martha Washington. Maria lived and worked at Arlington as a slave until 1826, when she married Charles Syphax, a slave who oversaw the dining room of Arlington House. Soon after Maria's marriage, Custis freed her and gave her a 17-acre plot in the southwest corner of the Arlington estate. Maria subsequently raised 10 children on her property. Tall trees and stretches of grassland reportedly surrounded Maria's white cottage. Legacy. Custis died in 1857 and was buried at Arlington alongside his wife, Mary Lee Fitzhugh Custis, who had died 4 years earlier. Custis's will provided that Arlington Plantation and its contents, including Custis's collection of George Washington's artifacts and memorabilia, would be bequeathed to his only surviving child, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, for her natural life, and upon her death, to his eldest grandson George Washington Custis Lee. White House Plantation in New Kent County and Romanceoak Plantation in King William County would be bequeathed to his other 2 grandsons, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee and Robert Edward Lee, Jr., respectively. Legacies of $10,000 each would be provided to his 4 granddaughters, based on the incomes from the plantations and the sales of other smaller properties. Certain property in Square No. 21, Washington City, to be bequeathed to Robert E. Lee and his heirs. Custis's slaves, numbered around 200, were to be freed once the legacies and debts from his estate were paid, but no later than 5 years after his death. Custis' death influenced the careers of Robert E. Lee and his 2 elder sons on the cusp of the American Civil War. Then Lt. Col. Robert E. Lee, named as the will's executor, took leave from his army post in Texas for 2 years to settle the estate. During this period, Lee was ordered to lead troops to quash John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. By 1859, Lee's eldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, transferred to an army position in Washington, D.C., so that he could care for Arlington Plantation, where his mother and sisters were living. Lee's second son, Rooney Lee, resigned his army commission, got married, and took over farming White House and Romanceoak plantations, near Richmond. Robert E. Lee was able to leave for Texas to resume his army career in February 1860. At the outbreak of the American Civil War, Union Army forces seized the 1,100-acre Arlington plantation for strategic reasons. The United States government then confiscated the Custis estate for non-payment of taxes. In 1863, a freedmen's village was established there for freed slaves. In 1864, Montgomery C. Meigs, Quartermaster General of the U.S. Army, appropriated some parts of Arlington Plantation for use as a military burial ground. After the Civil War ended, George Washington Custis leased and recovered the title for the Arlington Plantation from the United States government in 1882, when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in favor of Lee in United States v. Lee, 106 U.S. 196. Lee then sold the property back to the United States government for $150,000. Arlington House, built by Custis to honor George Washington, is now the Robert E. Lee Memorial. It is restored and open to the public under the auspices of the National Park Service, while the Department of Defense controls F.D. Mayer and Arlington National Cemetery on the remainder of the Arlington Plantation.